Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Frame and Sequence podcast. My name is Todd Rittendaro, and in this episode I sit down and chat with painter and sculptor James Michalopoulos in his New Orleans studio. Probably best known for his singular style, painting portraits of New Orleans shotgun houses and Creole cottages, James captures the spirit and essence of his subject in layer upon layer of thick impasto paint, brimming with color and energy. Today he divides his time between New Orleans and Burgundy. During a trip to France in 1990, he fell in love with Provence and the Burgundy region and bought a home near Cluny. The French countryside, with its Roman-era stone buildings and verdant fields, has become a large focus of his work, grappling with the notions of elemental biological life and the evidence of cohabitation with nature. His artwork continues to be shown extensively in the US and abroad in galleries and in private collections. And if you're ever in New Orleans, definitely visit his gallery in the French Quarter, as his large-scale works definitely need to be experienced in person. We go pretty deep in this episode, and James shares a lot about his process and the way he thinks. We talk about some technique, finding your style, and probably most importantly, finding your truth through your work, among a lot of other things. I personally got a lot out of this conversation, and I hope you do as well. Enjoy. Well, thank you, James, so much for doing this. I really appreciate you sitting down with me. I've admired your work for years now, since my very first visit to New Orleans when I first set foot in your gallery, and felt like your paintings had captured the magic and feeling of the city, which I know a lot of artists strive to do, but I'm really excited to be here in your studio in New Orleans and excited to ask you a bunch of questions that I wanted to ask you for a long time.
Terrific. Welcome.
Thanks.
Glad to be here too.
I remember reading in your bio that the first time you actually took up pencil and paper and started drawing was on a vacation to Niagara Falls.
That's right.
And what was it then that made you pick up pencil and paper?
Largely boredom. Yeah. I had brought some ponderous tomes to read. I was going to actually read an economics textbook, that I had been putting off for a while. And I can't believe it. It was like 2 volumes, an immense tome, and very dense. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I was there in Niagara Falls and enjoying the ambiance, and everything was great for a day or two. I think I expected more to do while I was there. And so on day 3, I basically, after a period of relaxation, just started to doodle and was enjoying that as an alternative to my reading.
And did you have a natural affinity for drawing right off the bat?
No, I would say not. I would say that I've still got a lot room to cover when it comes to drawing, actually. I think that I had a natural affinity for dissecting something technical, and that was very interesting to me on an intellectual level, the notion of perspective, 2-point, 1-point, 3-point, and that it was something that I could more or less scientifically extract. So I was very much on that level, and I would say the quality of the drawings was consistent with that too. Yeah.
And then at what point did you decide that you wanted to really go all in on drawing and painting?
I think that would probably have been quite a ways down the road. For me, what showed up was that it was an intriguing challenge, and that it was an enjoyable puzzle, and it was something that I could do for a period of time while I considered my next serious move. But it wasn't something that I actually considered that I would take on as a career. It was more something that I was going to use to occupy my time for a little while, and then make a serious decision to go back to graduate school and get on to whatever career I chose.
Right.
So it's kind of like that. It was a placeholder.
And what were you doing before that?
I was the manager of Cambridge Food Co-op, which is the largest storefront food co-op in the United States, actually in the world, and before that, the Boston Food Co-op. So it was actually that I was into community development, on several different levels. We were working on a bookstore and housing for underserved communities, and it was just an interesting notion to me as an alternative economic possibility, or one that was complementary to the system that we had, cooperative development.
Right.
And so I'd become, in school, influenced by some of the Swedish entrepreneurs that brought this cooperative vision to America, and had built a rather large cooperative industry in the Midwest. And so I thought, it looks like something that could work well in the times. And so I was pretty heavily invested in that, and looking at going on to continue my studies in either economics or perhaps law.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic departure then, to go the art route.
Yeah, it was a big change in direction for sure.
Yeah. And then did that coincide with your moving to New Orleans?
No, actually I got into that sort of after the tail end of my time in Boston. I had a couple of small businesses up there, Fruit Juice on the Loose and Magical Melon Mobiles. And I had a little grocery store called Franco's, and I decided to sell those, and did. And then my plan was to go back to school, and I thought I would teach and remain in Boston forever. I never thought I'd leave that town. I loved it. Well, as things go, I developed an interest in art and drawing.
So then what was it that first pulled you down to New Orleans?
Well, I came here on a lark. Basically, I had continued my studies in the art following my misadventure in Niagara Falls, and, just kind of developing my sensibility, my sense of art, and my drawing, and practicing on a daily basis, and enjoying my time off, and enjoying the spoils of the sale of my businesses. So I continued with that, and then I became influenced by a stream of philosophic thought in art, basically the notion of plein air painting, that really important work was done in situ, in the presence of my subject. So there was a prevailing ideology or certainly a strong stream in the art world then, and has been ever since the Impressionists, about the importance of this. And I became influenced by it and started to subscribe to it. So I was always working outside in front of things, which gets difficult in Boston along about October.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there I was in the middle of snowstorms trying to paint stuff in Boston, and realized that, no, this wasn't going to work for me. So I actually at some point relocated to DC, which was more temperate, but then at some point I had the same problem there. So I considered a southern locale where I could work through the winter, and at that time I was still drawing, but I was also doing watercolor and trying pastel, and broadening the range of media that I worked in. So I took a trip to New Orleans. I actually hitchhiked across the country and came into town and set up here. I planned to stay, 2 or 3 weeks, but I ended up spending 3 months maybe. And
New Orleans has that effect.
Yes, it does. It does. I definitely was fascinated with the city, fell in love with it. And at some point, my girlfriend from D.C. flew down to retrieve me, which I think in recollection was necessary. I may not have made the trip back.
Right. That's funny. During that time, do you remember, did you have a mentor of any kind, or were you looking at masters or just finding your own way?
No, I had no mentors, although I was very influenced by the art culture of the city. I certainly took advantage of the galleries, and I was often at Jackson Square watching people work. So I was very influenced, and a lot of what I was doing was learning fundamentals at that point. I attended to it. I basically was studying drawing and teaching myself. I had books, and I watched other people, and I learned where I could.
And were you moving more into oil or still playing with watercolor at that point?
No, actually, I was only doing, even then, I wasn't even in wet media. I had a moment with watercolor prior to that, but then left it and went back to the drawing, and actually became very influenced by the pastel work here in town. There was quite a scene of pastel portraits and pastel landscapes, and so the medium was very interesting to me, so I said, okay, I'm going to get it. And it has distinct advantages in the sense that you can select a color as opposed to having to necessarily make a color, although you can do that with a pastel by blending and all. It was my introduction to color. You could call it a gradual increase in the depth of engagement. It was a manageable step.
Right.
And that's a huge one, going from black and white to color.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so some people never even make it. And for me, it was something I did here under the influence of the Southern Light and all the work going on, and certainly the scene of pastels, which is more concentrated here than anywhere else in the country. I would say it's probably was the most intense scene for pastels anywhere. While some artists work exclusively in them anywhere, to here you could see 50 people working in them, and so it was a great opportunity for me.
It must have been incredible, yeah.
It was.
Wow.
Yeah, I would often take my coffee, go to the morning to Jackson Square, and I'd make my rounds, and I could watch 15 or 20 people work. I take notes, and then I'd go and try it out myself in City Park.
Yeah. And what people were pretty open about you asking questions, or?
For the most part, actually, not necessarily asking questions, but they're fine with you watching it. In many cases, they don't know.
Right.
Their back is to the wall or to the people behind them. They're facing their work and dedicated and concentration, and so people are passing by constantly observing people working. So I was just one of many people watching people work.
And then did you set up a routine for yourself? Like you mentioned, you went to Jackson Square, kind of picked it up. Was that a daily type of thing that you were doing?
Yeah. Not strictly speaking, a formal routine, but it was certainly my routine. Yeah, I would go there. I mean, had at this point become a earnest engagement for me, and so it was a very regular part of my day, and I often was very pointedly looking for certain things. Like I could see things in certain people's work that I admired, and I would try to learn from that, and then use that in whatever way in my own work, much like I would from a book otherwise or from a video. But this was live, and I could see it being constructed, and it was prior to YouTube. So anyway,
incredible.
Yeah, it was a great school in a way.
And then that was New Orleans, like early '80s, right? Or
that's right,
mid '80s.
Mm-hmm.
And do you mind painting a little bit of a picture of what the city was like then?
Yeah, I mean, there were a large number of artists working on Jackson Square. In fact, it was impossible to get a license to work out there. And I tried several times and was unable to get an A license, what was designated an A license, which means that you were able to work in front of the cathedral, which is where most all the activity was.
Right.
In years prior to that, artists were licensed and chose to work in the alleyway and Pirates Alley. And there were still some old timers in there, wizened pros, and I ended up with one of those grade B licenses, and so I was down there in a much quieter zone, which suited my temperament at the time. I was able to concentrate and work on my work, my studies, and not be as bothered by the commercial activity.
Right.
It was a quieter, more tranquil spot. So it worked fine for me. It was definitely a survival level income, without a doubt, but nevertheless an interesting place with wonderful trees and an amazing environment. Working next to some artists of considerable interest who also were somewhat less commercially driven or driven by need.
Right.
So it was a good spot.
Oh, incredible. What a grad school.
Yeah. An unusual grad school, for sure.
But the fact that you made it yourself and really got out of it, obviously, changed your life. So
it was a great way to immerse yourself in technique. Now, I'm sure there were limitations to it also, without a doubt. Being and working in an environment which is primarily directed toward a touristic audience and commercially driven had its limitations. That was fine. At my level of development, really I was concentrating on technique, much less on, expression, the nature of my expression, the importance, the message, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it was much more about the actual elements of putting something together. So in that sense, it was a very appropriate school.
I mean, you have such a distinct style. Do you remember a point, or was it a conscious decision to move more into what your work is probably now known as? I know it's a constant evolution, obviously, but anybody could probably recognize one of your paintings as distinctly yours.
Yes.
Do you remember making a choice to move in that direction?
Yes, I do. I think it was a few things, but it's difficult to kind of tease out the truth from, the recitation of it over the years. But, for me, there were a couple of moments that were critical. One of them was a seminar I had taken in the S training and Earhart Seminars training. And so it's now part of Landmark, what they call Landmark. And so this is an organization that's kind of dedicated to people's fullest development. It's an organization that works to support people in self-expression. And there were a bunch of artists on the square, Fred Haynes and Marilyn Haynes in particular, but there were a number of others that had been involved in this organization and had recommended to me over the years to get engaged in it. And also in Boston, people had approached me and suggested that I might like it because it was kind of like an empowerment technology. And I was very skeptical, like one is about organizations that claim to, help you find your life and find velocity in your interests and this kind of thing, right? But of course I took it with a grain of salt, but then after a number of experiences with them, I said I'd take a chance and looked at it. I found myself in a seminar. I did take the S training, and in a seminar, and in that seminar, there was a kind of a challenge to look at your work as an opportunity for breakthrough in you personally and self-expression. And so there was an actual concentration on that. And I took that challenge into my art and looked at a number of different ways that I would challenge my status quo, challenge the status quo around me, and took it on very pointedly from that viewpoint. And so I found myself painting large abstracts in City Park, doing watercolors at dawn, and then working stylistically. Because, at that point, while I was still, a very young artist, I had developed a set of collectors, and I was having a reasonable amount of success at what I was doing. And I had a style that I felt very comfortable with. Not entirely. One is never entirely comfortable, but, I was there and I was doing work that I was proud of and people liked, right? And so I was able to sell to enough to make a living at it, and things were developing. But this was a new challenge. It was actually, they were setting me up to look for what would be a breakthrough in my personal expression, So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And in that context, I found myself on a street I'd say it was about 7:30 in the evening on maybe an early June night in the Bywater. And I had set up in front of this unbelievably beautiful Victorian, like in great shape. Looked like it had been built by a shipwright. I would bet my bottom dollar it had been.
Yeah.
Right, so it's up there in the maritime neighborhood of the Bywater. And it's like a beautiful boat in the midst of devastation. All the houses around it were kind of abandoned and decrepit or poorly maintained. And there's this white boat and with this marvelous front porch on it, and this elegant couple in their, I would guess, 80s would walk out every now and then on the porch. And I was just so taken by the poetry, the quiet beauty of it. So I pulled over my little scooter, my Vespa, and I set my easel up and I started to work on it. And I was working nights because it was so hot that I couldn't paint in the day. My paints, I think I was working in acrylic at the time. My paints were drying so fast that it was impossible for me to work in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
And I had, I think, an obligation. I don't know what it was. I was going to be in a show or something. And I thought, I have to make this work. So I started to work at like 7:30 at night. And then I would work through the night.
Wow.
And then get up and sleep in the day, right?
Yeah.
Just so that I could get it done. So it was an interesting set of challenges where I had to find a street light that lit my subject, and then, or like the lighting in one way or another, and then have a way of lighting my own work surface. So I had batteries, and I had all the food that I needed, and wine or coffee, depending on the circumstance.
For sure.
So there I was, and I set myself up and started working on this. And this lady comes out from right behind me, and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I explained to her, I was setting up. She's like, "Wow, this is going to be fun." And she sits down and cracks a beer and turns on some music. And so it was like a party, right?
Right.
So, I just basically was friendly and attended to my work. And then about hour 2 or so, she'd ask me second, third time if I'd like a beer, and things were going along okay. So I said, sure. The music got turned on or louder. And it kind of went like that. I got a couple of beers into it. It was probably around midnight, and the music was wailing, and I was taken by the kind of musicality of the situation in general, right, and felt a need to swing this into the art itself. So I felt in a way like I was moving music into the visual, or looking for the music in that visual moment, and that this was my guide for me.
Right.
And so it was that was one of the very, very first moments.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that moment was only about that, but definitely it was a kind of a combination of that seminar's opening for me to take the risk into a different kind of expression that looked very different from a stylized representation of the subject into a personalized representation of that subject. Right. So here I am. She wants to dance. The thing's right there, and I'm like dancing with the picture, and it was like, holy mackerel, a great moment.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah. It was really a fun night.
I was actually going to ask you. Your paintings have such a lyrical quality that I was going to ask you if music played a part, but obviously it must.
I do love music, and the city is so musical.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that is very, true to and comfortable in this interpretation is the organic nature of the town. Mm-hmm. Now, New Orleans is built of wood and stone and steel, but wood and stone principally, the old city. And it's also built on a very pliant subsurface,
right,
And so, there's a lot of movement, a lot of coming and going, and a lot of organic life. Essentially, if you fell asleep for a month or two, the whole city would be overgrown.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Sure. So when you woke up, and there's this thing about a lyricism and a organic quality, and so magical, the two of them, and I felt kind of swoon, if you will, taken by it,
yeah,
and allowed myself to be in a swoon with it.
Right.
There it is.
Great.
That's often the way I think of it too. I feel like I open up and I allow it to take me where it will.
Right. Yeah, that's such a great way to approach it.
Yeah. It is. It's so much more organic than where I originally started, which was a very, very kind of formulaic. And I don't want to make any of it negative, because a lot of this is part of learning, and a lot of it is part of it's just another approach. And there are people that spend their lives in other approaches that are totally valid. But there was this thing about looking at something and then translating it through a technical viewpoint, kind of prism of a scientific perspective.
Right.
That would guarantee you a high fidelity rendering. Right? So there's a kind of visual fidelity, which is not nothing. It's something. Sure. It really is. We're talking about something, right?
Yeah.
Visually. And that's a lot. But it excludes often life. It excludes something perhaps more important. And so in this look at personal expression, what I became present to was, while I was unimpeachable in the rectitude of my expression, I was miles away from a kind of felt expression.
Right.
So, that's what opened up for me, and it is what is always opening up, in the realm of communication, is there's always some kind of frontier, So I think an artist's life lives largely in that, I don't want to call it a confront, but in that possibility for revelation, personal and social.
Yeah.
So there's this question about what you're going to talk about and how much you're willing to say about it and what kind of risks you're willing to take, right?
Right.
So really, in a way, that's the setup for an artist's life. it sounds like a kind of a spiritual setup, and I would say that's an actual fact.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to look at it differently and some to trivialize it, and so then we would go into like empty stylizations.
Right. Yeah.
Style itself is, in a way, it speaks to temporary, and it speaks to fashion, right? And nothing wrong with that. It can be very expressive. But the point is, if you're aping something, you're probably not speaking very authentically.
Right.
And what I'm talking about here is the opportunity in any art piece to authentically represent what it is that you think and feel at that moment, right?
Right.
And look, that's a big battlefield. That's a wonderful space to be in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would never get bored with that examination or participation with the internal versus the external and how you represent it.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Speaking of that, how would you say you approached the subject? Would you go with an open mind and see what presented itself, or were you out looking for a specific thing with maybe an idea in mind that when you saw that thing, it helped express the idea you had inside?
It could go either way, but mostly the way I roll is I look for something that excites me. And it's ineffable. Wow, I'm sure if I spent some time, I could probably put some points on it, but I don't care so much about that.
Yeah.
I'm basically going like, okay, what turns me on?
Right.
I'm looking for excitement, and you find it in the most amazing places. And so I look for that. I just go open my book on a day, and I'm like, where's it going to take me? So there's something like that, and then there's another thing that shows up, and it's like, it's almost a little bit more abstract in the sense that it's like I'm asking myself the question, what's exciting right now? What do I feel? So there's less looking out there for something that's exciting and more looking internally. So I'm like, oh, do I see a possibility in something? Right? So like I look at something and I go like, look, if I feel it or I don't. And sometimes you get it wrong, right? That can happen, so you find yourself in the middle of something and you're like, oh my God. But that's an interesting challenge in its own right too.
Yeah.
It's like cooking and you go like, I added too much salt. So now what do you do?
Right.
Do you poison people or do you add something to it, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like, look, you're constantly confronted by your commitment to contribute something, right?
Right.
So you want to contribute something that enlivens yourself and enlivens the world, something that gives voice to your spirit, right? And life in general. And then you're looking at breakdown as it shows up all over the place. You don't have enough paint, you're out of canvas, or the canvas isn't right, or it's hot, or your kids are calling, you're hungry, whatever it is, and you include it all. That's all mundane,
right.
But there's a whole another set of problems along the way that are actually generically related to making a piece of art. Like let's say, for example, you go there with the best of intentions and great excitement, and you look at it and it sucks, right. And you're like, well, you may be in just a state, and you may find out tomorrow morning that you love it. That honestly does happen to me.
Yeah.
It's usually not as extreme as that, but it happens a lot where I'm like, and then the next day I like it. But then there's also the other thing that shows up where you think it's great, and then the next day you look at it and you're like, oh. And so there's this issue with your integrity and staying there and being true to it.
Right.
So you got to go back into that work, and it's constantly a process, and I'm sure this sounds like a lot of other professions at this moment, where you do your damn best. Mm-hmm. You're on the line to make what you can, to do the best that you can.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're interested, and you better be, because there's a lot of other people that are very interested in that, and they're going to eat your lunch if you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting. There's a wonderful trend now. People are really bringing back figurative work and sort of leaning towards that classical style. But I was having a conversation with an art teacher of mine, and he was saying it's great they're bringing back all these technical skills, but not a lot of people have much to say. with those skills, which is kind of interesting.
So the figurative is coming back, but not a lot of people have much to say.
Right, and they're technically gorgeous. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
like there's a portrait of that person and it's beautiful, but now what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, and you might even compare that to mastery in classical piano too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good point, and I would say that technical mastery is not equivalent to meaningful expression.
Right.
It's technical mastery, and that'll get you a certain distance, and it's what some people are really, really interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, it doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with like your personal expression. So there's this question about what is your personal expression, and again, we're back at the frontier of what you're willing to be revealing of.
Right.
So, like there are issues of vulnerability there. There are issues of courage, and there are issues of personal mastery. So, truth telling is a very important thing. And some art courses know that and are engaged in it, and others not. But honestly, it's a lot like writing also. It's one thing to write a technical manual,
Right.
tell you how to operate your lawnmower. It's another to talk about how you feel about your lawnmower and your lawn being cut, right? And what you say there may be poignant and touching, right? Most probably if you tell the truth about it. But then what's the risk there? You tell the truth, right?
Yeah.
About your love for your lawn. Well, people are going to know what a nerd you are. They're going to know, what a hick or hoke you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you willing to own that? And I think you should.
Yeah.
Right? Honestly. But it takes a certain willingness, to stand up and be proud around that and to tell that truth. But the importance of it is so critical. It means, first of all, some element or measure of self-love, or at least self-exposure. Like there's a lot of artists that are there are artists that are very forthcoming, vulnerable, and open, that are self-loathing. And while, it's perhaps regrettable, it is revealing and poignant. And it speaks to, everybody can relate to that, at least in part,
Yeah.
or we're touched by it, even hurt by it, empathetic with it. And I think the important part of it is less the emotion, but it is the emotion. It is the expression of an emotion, of a state, of a thought, it's a
Right.
truth, if
Yeah.
you will, right?
Absolutely.
And so there's the deal. Go there. Go to the poignant. And then you will see that it's quite divergent from what would look like a mere didactic recitation of reality in front of you. It's like inclusive of you. Like your twistedness is in the middle of it.
Right.
Right? So, all right, let's see it. Wow, you're very timid. Wow. But, if you own that, the timid person is a wonderful person. Oh my God. You're like, you're the most beautiful thing ever, right?
Right.
And so you're like, okay, let's go there, right? So that's how I see it. It's like a frontier. There's a Zen master named Joko Beck from Houston who talks about everybody's in a boat and they're going toward a shore, and the what's up is how close we're willing to go. We have that out in front of us, and how open are we to go there toward that shore for us, And so we open, and this is the process of opening, and it's what takes place in an artistic expression. It is the philosophic underpinning of that vulnerability that's expressed.
I think that's a huge takeaway for a lot of artists, especially, I would guess, including myself, most artists are pretty sensitive types. So it's like, how do you make the commitment to yourself to open up and be vulnerable? I guess that's the real question.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's different for everyone, I'm sure.
That's right. I mean, where it will take you is extraordinarily personal.
Yeah.
I mean, each of us is so unique. It's unknowable. But what is discernible is a commitment to go there. And that you can witness in people all day long, how much they're there or how much they're not there.
Right.
You can witness commitment very evidently. Now, where that's taking that person is very, very difficult to know, and unique. Everybody's passions are different, but where they're willing to go. Now, that's what gets somebody gets their pocket knife out and sees them whittling a snake on a bar of soap, as opposed to sitting and playing a video game for the rest of the day.
Right.
Is a certain degree of commitment to their personal expression. Do you know how many snakes they failed at? And you may even feel that is a totally lame thing to represent, juvenile even, right?
Right.
But I'll tell you what, I have a great deal of respect for it, because it's the expression of their mentality. It's the expression of their passion.
Yeah.
And I think it's the way genius is born. And what we ought to be doing is telling that kid, all right, you're off into that pogo stick. Here's another one.
Yeah.
Hop higher. So
Yeah.
that's where I look at it.
Yeah, that's a great point of view. I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess that leads me to my next question a little bit. Speaking of that vulnerable part, and while you're developing a style and developing a body of work, at some point there's a desire to maybe start showing and potentially selling.
Yeah.
Was that an organic thing because you were sort of out on the street and maybe selling a piece or two, or did you say I'm now at a point where I feel the confidence to take this to market?
Well, I had it more or less. I have a kind of a commercial orientation to a fair number of things that I've taken on in my life, and I kind of always felt that I saw in my work as a young man many artists that were disdainful of the world of commerce, and it's kind of a cliche almost that artists are commercially inept and disengaged on that level, and rightfully so, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff around that.
Yeah, there's a stigma.
Which is really not so. Actually, there's quite a number of artists who are articulate about all manner of things, and mathematically inclined or commercially inclined or technically capable. I mean, really, artists come in all varieties, and it's not a right way to be. That is, in other words, asocial and uncommercial. Right, so like right on from the very start, actually I had a friend in Boston whose brother was an artist, and he was a very talented renderer, and I was always in love with his work. It was very poetic and had a romantic quality to it, and he was always very commercial. Like, he'd be selling his work in the subway in Boston, and I was like, oh my God, it's so good, and he would be totally humble about it, and he'd sell his work for very little money, but enough to pay the rent. He had a nice apartment. I forget exactly what part of town it was. It wasn't actually in Boston proper, but he managed to make his living at it, and I was so impressed by that.
Yeah.
So I had that influence, from an early age, or even prior to my art, making art. I saw him doing this in a self-effacing way.
Yeah.
So then I came here. And actually, I was used to working even before that on the street, because I'd go out and I had a bicycle at first, and then I had a scooter, and I'd go to a situation and I'd set up and I'd stay there. Usually, I'd do a drawing over a period of 4 or 5 days.
Wow.
I mean, this is not a fast thing, right? I'm learning, right? So I'm like actually with books at the same time that I'm drawing, And I read a chapter, and I'd go there, and I'd work on my drawing, and I read a little bit more, and I'd draw some more. And then I'd put the drawings that I did out on the sidewalk next to me while I'm drawing. And if somebody came by and asked about them, I would sell them if I could, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, from the very, very start, I was present to the possibility of making some modest money that enabled me to continue my work and studies.
Right.
And I felt like, look, I'll just do the best that I can.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for a long time, I was making $1 an hour, I would say, and that was okay.
Yeah.
Because you can actually, if you do it, if you're really committed, you can live on that, not opulently,
Right.
But look, this is America. This is America, man. How many people are starving? Nobody's starving. I take a risk, right? So I'm out there. I'm taking some time. I'm studying drawing. I'm poor. I'm having fun. You can't believe the appreciation that a lot of people have at that sincerity of all of that. And also, for me, having worked like 60, 70 hours a week as a manager of an organization of people with thousands of people in it, this was a respite. This was a retreat. This was a treat, to be involved in a serious intellectual pursuit and relative comfort. So there were a lot of things about it that were fascinating, and I definitely was engaged on the commercial level right away. So it was great on that level.
That's really cool.
Yeah. I would go there again if I had to. There's a certain fascinating thing about the marketplace at ground level.
For sure.
Like people come along and they'll say anything to you. Like they just tell you the truth. There's no consequence. You're a street artist, right? I can remember people saying anything, really. It was just fascinating. And then I can remember people telling me to take care and to watch out and be careful because, I could fall in hard times. And I can remember saying to them, there's no place to fall to. I'm already here. I'm already on the street. There's no lower, right? This is it.
Right.
And there's something great about that, that you can't fall any lower,
Yeah.
So there's a certain groundedness in it.
Yeah, and almost a certain, weirdly, freedom.
Yes, that's right. Freedom's
level,
just another word for nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
And there's some wisdom in that, without a doubt. I didn't have anything really to lose.
Right.
Yeah, which is great.
And then, so at some point, obviously, things started picking up, and at what point did you realize you wanted to have your own gallery?
Well, at some point along the way, a few things started to happen. Like, I got to a point where there was a demand, an active demand for my work.
Cool.
Yeah,
That's a good place to be.
and that was prior to my stylistic shifts earlier on. But there was a fair amount of demand for my work. I was actually had a list of clients, and I was working very steadily. Things were coming along fairly nicely. I started to get invitations to show. And so I started to show around town. I showed at Carol Robinson's gallery, and I showed with Daska Roth up on Magazine, and began to show in other parts of the country occasionally. So it was a good harbinger. I still was working on the street, though, at that time, and there became a tension. And I can remember people saying to me, specifically the galleries, look, this has got to break at some point. You can't be out here hustling this stuff on the street and then expect to sell it in the gallery.
Makes sense.
I started to look at that as a conflicting engagement. And at some point, one of my associates said to me, that's it, you've got to make the change. And she supported me in making that change. Really, there's a certain weddedness that you can get to the savage life. And I kind of felt very comfortable in it. There's a lot of freedom inside of that. I had an apartment on Rampart Street that cost me $75 a month. And the landlord at one point raised the rent from $75 to, I think, $105. And I had a whole floor of a building upstairs with a balcony in the front and the back and a backyard. Now, it wasn't opulent by any means, and it was a smallish apartment, but it was way enough for me to work in and live in as a single man, and the backyard too, and affordable. And plus, he let me go 1 year without paying the rent. And then he said, please, will you please pay the rent, right? So it was another interesting point for me. Okay, I'm going to refer to it again because I was in that seminar at that time, right? And there was this thing about completion of stuff. And there were two things that were incomplete. One is I was behind on my rent about a year, and he was like so compassionate. He loved my work, and he had taken some of it in trade, and he was very thoughtful and empathetic. But still, I was incomplete, not having paid that rent. And so in this seminar, I became present to the cost of that in completion. And another one was that I had student loans that I realized at that point that paying them off the rate that I was paying them or not paying them, I can't remember. But I think I was paying them at the rate at which I was paying them, it would go on for the rest of my life.
Wow.
And even maybe that they would grow. I forget. But there are people out there like that,
Yeah.
And like, I was like, oh my God, look at this. This is the trajectory, right? And so there was a real challenge for me there. And it was right in that same time period. And I said, okay, look, I'm going to look at shifting the way that I go. And there were two partners that I had in that time frame, two women, friends of mine, that were like, we love what you do. We like you too. And we're going to support you in moving out of this, I don't know what you want to call it, bohemian lifestyle. All right, that's a very colorful way to put it, right? So I had my bicycle and tons of free time and just like loving the engagement in my study and work. But sometimes you need a bit more obligation,
Right. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes obligation or commitment and engagement can be an elevating experience, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? So I had this commitment to art, but I think that it was great for me to enlarge that commitment and enlarge my commitment to sharing it and enlarge my commitment to participation in the actual financial world, right?
Right.
So I was like, okay, here we go, and I'm going to take this on and do better. And we moved out of that apartment. I moved out of that apartment. And thankfully, it was coinciding with some success in the galleries. And I managed to rent a house up in the Irish Channel. It was a nice house, big, Victorian, had a front porch on it. I mean, it was by no means an opulent neighborhood. And in that time period, it was actually a fairly abandoned neighborhood. But still, it was a huge move for me into this home of the end of the 19th century with high ceilings and wonderful windows and complicated arrangement, a double parlor in the front. So it was like magic.
Yeah.
And I got up there, and my rent was 4 or 5 times higher than I had been used to. Thank God people were liking the work, and I was able to rise to the occasion, which would now, if you looked at it comparatively, be a very low rent, but still, it was a huge shift for me.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool insight, though, to make that commitment to growing the art practice.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge distinction, yeah.
That was incredible. And those two women supported me in doing that. They weren't going to take no. And they got me up into that. And they had confidence, full confidence, that I could rise to the occasion much more than I did. I dragged my feet, I resisted, and they basically found it and forced me to move. And so I got in there, and I was like, oh my God, like what I'm doing is not going to make the rent, so I have to like wake up and get with it, right?
Yeah.
So that's the way it goes. Like, you cannot pay thousands of dollars a month rent behaving like your rent was only $200,
Right.
So you can't behave the same way and handle those same obligations. So it required me to recontextualize the passage of my day.
Yeah.
Which I managed to do. I'm not suggesting that the rent was thousands of dollars. It wasn't, but it's just a metaphor,
Sure.
So I enlarged my obligation. My promise got a lot bigger, and I committed myself to playing the game to make that work. And so there was a lot of personal adjustment in the middle of it. It was great.
Yeah. Nothing like forced growth, right?
That's right. That's right.
And then, so is that when you started moving into bigger paintings?
Yeah, it coincidentally
Yeah.
did move into bigger paintings at that time. I can remember making quite a few larger works, and yeah, definitely I was.
In your first sort of gallery shows, were those still the pastels, or were they oils as well?
No, they were all manner. I had, at that point, I've been doing pastel, acrylics, watercolor even, but more acrylics, oils, and pastel.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd more or less moved from the world of drawing into the world of active paint.
I mean, just surrounded by some of these big pieces here, it's just these houses are incredible. They have such they just leap off the canvas at you.
Yeah, I love to work large, and I typically do. Although what I find is often, again, I'm constantly finding out what I don't know. And that is that I have had some galleries, mostly in Europe, asking for very small work. Like I have a show running in France, and they wanted small work because they explained to me, like, we're not in Paris, and people have lower ceilings, and they want smaller work, and your work is often very big. And I said, oh, okay, let me do it. And so I started making small works. Well, I spent that summer painting small works, and I loved it. And so it's like, really, honestly, there's a lot of joy in any kind of a challenge, once you give into it, I suppose. Like, that's true for me. Right. Maybe not for someone else, but I loved making the small works. Now I feel like I can make work any size and be happy with it, that there's pleasures in all of them. And basically, I kind of alternate. I go back and forth. I'll work big for a while, and then I'll go into some small work, and I hang there for a while, and until I tire of it or get a wild hair and feel like going large.
Right. Do you keep any sort of sketchbook, or have you ever
sketched first?
Or like sketchbook, like a daily?
Yeah, well, I constantly carry a sketchbook, and sometimes I carry two, and I'm constantly sketching. And sometimes they're relevant to the paintings that I'm doing, and sometimes they're not.
Yeah.
A lot of times they're notions, they're ideas, and a lot of times they have to do with commercial work that I do. Sometimes they have to do with sculpture. A lot of times they have to do with sculpture or inventions. But I feel very comfortable with a pen or pencil, and enjoy drawing. And I do scores of notebooks a year, both in terms of notes and in terms of sketches.
Yeah. So
it's voluminous and pleasurable and difficult to organize.
I bet.
Honestly, they just pile up. So it's amazing and wonderful, and I go back 3 years into some of them, and I'm like, oh my God, I completely forgot about this, or,
right.
It's always a lot of fun. And I do sketch before I make a painting. So my process is basically to look for something or imagine something. Like, for instance, in the last 2 weeks, I've only worked from my mind. So, I just set up before an easel, and I have an idea of something that I'd like to paint. And it's basically an iteration of an image that I did a few weeks ago. So I basically became inspired by something that was existent in life, although it'll just be something that I remember. But typically, I'm relating to something. I'm relating to something, in my mind. And I have that vision in my head, and I have different notions or takes on it. And I go to the easel the next day or the day after, or whenever I finish work and getting ready for the next one, and I refer to that. And I'm like, is there something there? I'm like, in my head, is there something there? Is there something that I feel like I've got to say? And could I have some fun with that?
Right.
And so I do. And you wouldn't believe the mutation of these babies. It's just a trip and a half to see where they take you. And it's fun, and I feel like it's totally organic and legitimate. And who cares about legitimacy? Legitimacy in this case is qualified by their effectiveness, which to me is a way of asking, are they evocative? Do they speak to me? Are they in any way enlivening, illuminating, fun, challenging, do I feel like there's some interest here? And, that's the way it goes. And I look at it, that's my judgment tool. I hold that up and I go like, wow, this is rocking. Well, I'm going to keep going. It's honestly, where I'm looking right there in that moment, it's less judgment about the last painting. It's almost always a judgment about the truth for me, right in my heart. Yeah. Is this rocking? Right? That's where the rubber hits the road. If it's not rocking, I need to do something about that. Right? And there it is. That's where you meet yourself,
Yeah.
And where do we go from here? Do I have the heart, the spirit? Is this true? Do I even care? Am I fooling around with flowers when I should be drawing a car? And, so you're telling hopefully some truths there, and it gets you onto some railroad tracks that take you somewhere.
Right. I think, that's a great barometer. I think I often too get locked into is this technically working instead of is it hitting the right buttons?
As we all do.
Yeah.
Of course. And I would say it's probably one of the most important injunctions that I would put out there for another artist, and that would be watch that one. Really. This is not primarily, foundationally about a technical expression. Yeah, technical expressions come up. You may have them as your largest challenge. Not illegitimate, but you're not going to live there forever.
Right.
And at some point, it's much more about, look, even if it's very, very important for you to address technical issues, don't leave behind your heart. You've got to say, all right, I know I'm working on chiaroscuro. I know I'm working on values of colors. I know I'm working on line. Screw it. I'm going to talk about anger. I'm going to talk about the generosity in this person's face. I'm going to talk about the yellowness of this flower and how it makes me feel. Right? And so you go there and you screw line quality. You leave it on the table for a while, right?
Yeah.
So this is a matter of perspective and balance, because man, you really want to watch the poison of doing it right, and there is a notion of doing it right that can creep in all manner of things. That it's not only about the technical expression, but it's about the way that you express about that.
Yeah.
Is that doing it right? I mean, should it look like graffiti? I mean, is that right now? Well, yeah, in some people's book, it is right now, right? But is that right for you, right? So I would say, this is a context that you want to look at. Why are you in this, and what are you in it for? And part of this is about sharing your truth. Some of it might be about you making a living doing this too. I'm not saying that we don't live in that world.
Right.
And there are things that condition that discussion. Some of them are stylistic, some of them are just merely commercial considerations, and you have to take all that into account. But the thing that I'm arguing for most of all is the poetic possibility of revelation in art. I get it, you live once, and you really don't want to leave your voice in a bag in favor of the right way to do it. So remember that. Bring it out. If you can only do it once a week, bring it out. If you can do it every day, bring it out.
Yeah.
And then start to condition. Maybe you bring some technique to your personal expression instead of bringing your personal expression to technique. Let's have a sense of superior commitment here. Where I got this as much as anything, I was looking at Max Ernst's work. Mm-hmm. And I think I was in MoMA in New York, and I was walking around and looking at everything. And one of the things that was most powerful to me was this drawing that he had all this black line around figures, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, thick, heavy black line around these figures. And I'm like, oh my God. I mean, it's totally unnatural. And they were so powerful.
Yeah.
They were so powerful. It was they were three figures and they were all emotion, no technique at all. And man, they were just knock you off your feet. And I was like, wow, there's a lesson there,
Yeah, for
there's
sure.
a lesson. Not right, not wrong, but real, And so, whatever, I'm putting that out there. There's a lot of examples like that where you can find it, where there's a truth told that leaves a prioritization or a concentration on technique behind. And it's a natural thing for people who are developing their skill to put a lot of focus on technique, because it serves expression. There's another downside that can come from a neglect of technique. And that's called, unqualified emotiveness, maybe. Mm-hmm. And it is a very evident expression without structure.
Right.
Which is, look, you see that all the time. Like, what's your goal? You want to communicate, right? So you want to communicate, which means that you're responsible for what you say over there in the head of somebody that you just spoke to.
Right.
It ain't just out of your mouth, right? Because you can communicate out of your mouth. What you're more doing is like relieving yourself of something. But did they get it? And a whole lot of the time they didn't get it. So there's at least an element of responsibility for you to be responsible for what somebody hears as much as what you've said, right? In the real world of communication.
Right. No, that's a huge distinction, I think.
Yeah.
To make, yeah.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah. It's like if you want to write a poem in French, know a little bit of French.
Oh, beautiful. Did anybody get it?
Right.
Right. Now, maybe you write a poem in English and then you consider the fact that there's a French word that cuts to the core. And you want to add that. And you do it. And c'est bien. On a réussi. You add it and you arrived with it.
Yeah.
And that's great. So but that is a qualification. There is a qualification of what's there, what have I created. I'm liking that. I'm working that one a lot right now.
Yeah.
That's an important distinction.
I'm going to take that on. We're talking about French stuff a little bit. Now, you spend part of your year in France now.
Yes, I do.
And how long have you been doing that?
God, forever. Like 30 years, maybe?
Wow.
Yeah, long time. I was invited to do a show in the south of France like 30 some years ago. I went over and I started showing with that gallery, and out of that I found myself with a Swiss gallery. So I was going over in the summer and doing these shows, and sometimes in Spain or Germany, eventually in England. And I was spending more time over there. And at one point, well, it was just a simple practical fact that I would fly into Paris and go from there. Paris was kind of like the best place to fly into.
Yeah.
Probably was the least expensive. And I would travel down A6, which is the main artery in France, to the south of France, where I typically would show. Or I would go down A6 and to the Midi in France, and I'd hit Macon, like Macon in Georgia, and burn left for Lausanne and Geneva. Always making that trajectory. And one day I was on my way to Lausanne, and I got a call from the gallery director asking me how the voyage was going, and I said, it's beautiful out. I'd like to stop on the side of the road and take some photos. And he was a little upset, being Swiss and punctual.
For sure.
But I said, I'm going to do it. What's 20 minutes? It was so gorgeous, and Burgundy is just stunningly beautiful.
Yeah.
So I got off the road at a place called Tournou. I started wandering around, and I was just like, oh my God, I cannot believe how beautiful these rolling hills are, these small villages. And so I called him and I said, I'm going to be a little bit later. I ended up spending a good part of the afternoon and then getting back on the road. Well, it was transformative for me. I knew that I wanted to spend time in France at that point, in the countryside, not in Cannes or Perpignan or Paris, but in France, Le Profonde. Anyway, I got into Switzerland and I shared my excitement about that. And while they were somewhat dismissive, it never left me as a thought.
And then at some point you bought a property in Burgundy?
Yes, exactly. Actually, I said to the gallery, which was a great thing. In Europe, often, you get a patron or a gallery and they will support your work. And I found a patron in Switzerland who supported my trips there. And so they basically gave me a place to live and work in Switzerland for, 2 or 3 years. And then after this discovery, I said, I'm very interested in living in France and in this particular village that I went through.
Yeah.
And while they were somewhat surprised, they said, fine. Well, I requested that they find me an apartment there, and they said they would be more than happy to do that. So they went over there, and instead of finding me an apartment, they actually bought a building and then said, we're going to give you the apartment and the downstairs, and we're going to keep the upstairs.
Wow.
It was great, but a little close for comfort. So I said, well, I'm going to find my own place. I socked into the Crazy Mother, which is a local theater in the town of Chardonnay. It's actually Chambon, part of Chardonnay, sous Chardonnay. And that's where the grape came from, So there I was in this little wild local theater, which is a wonderful theater. That's how I actually discovered that little village. Was I went to the theater to see these performances, and I was like, oh my God, these people are so talented.
Wow.
And I became a regular at the theater, and actually they had a little hotel. And I ended up staying in that little hotel and eventually renting a barn that they had not far from the theater. So I was there for God knows how long, but I'd say 3 months. And finally, because I was showing and working, and at some point my accountant said to me, look, you're spending enough money that you should really consider maybe buying something.
Yeah.
Or it wouldn't hurt, right? So I looked around everywhere, and I found a very inexpensive house in a small village that was abandoned for 100 years and had no plumbing or electricity or anything. And I think it was probably 700 years old, I'm going to guess, maybe.
Wow, incredible.
It could have been a little less, but it was really old. And as it turned out, I ended up buying 3 little houses next to each other for slightly over $20,000.
Yeah.
And, I'm a handy guy, so they were tiny, like one-room houses, and I ended up punching holes in them, putting them together, and making a very interesting little dwelling on a slight slope.
Wow.
All of them had wine cellars, and one of them had actual wine press in the back, so I actually had a little winery and a barn.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it was so amazing,
It sounds like it.
And not one in the village spoke English. And there was no internet, and I didn't have a telephone, and I had power in one of the houses and plumbing, if you want to call it that, in one of the houses. And so it was a great challenge, and I had to learn to speak French. And I mean, literally, I travel like maybe 5 miles to a payphone at the end of the day with my bottle of wine, and I'd set up for my phone call,
Right.
and it was great fun.
It sounds incredible.
It was.
Oh, man.
And locked in another world.
Yeah, for sure. Do your artistic pursuits differ there than they do in New Orleans?
My artistic pursuits?
In terms of what you're interested in painting or what you're interested in engaging with?
Yes, they are. They're very different. First of all, it's hilly. Terrain's different. The flora is different and fauna is different. Mm-hmm. So the people and the plants are unique. And I originally, when I first started, I was basically when I first worked there, I was more or less still doing my New Orleans subject matter, but I painted more figures, which typically was the way that I adjusted to my European shows. Was I showed mostly figures and sometimes, cars and a little bit of architecture, but very shortly thereafter, as it became a more frequent engagement, I started to paint the subject matter around me. So very shortly thereafter, I was painting the village and painting the landscape. So the landscape became a subject for me, the French landscape, and continued with my interest in the figure. Also, I started to work with French models and people in cafes and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So typically that's my MO. Where I am, I do what's around me.
Yeah.
I like to be influenced by it. Like it fits my MO of just kind of being influenced by and taken by what is around me, and I seeing that as the healthiest thing. Now, like I'm not always like that. Like there are times when I'm totally obsessed by an overbusy roof brain. But, there are other times when I can let go of that. In my best moments, I'm here for what's going on and sensible to the beauty of that sunlight on the house falling next to me, or this bee that lands there. And I'm like, oh my God. But other days, of course, you're too busy and you're worried about whatever, the political situation or your bills or your fight with your brother or whatever thing that life has you in the middle of.
Yeah.
So... But here I am, this totally quiet village with very little of everything. what an interesting challenge to go out and try to buy green beans, and learn how to say that. And so I got myself a little book, that phonetically said how to speak French. And I started to wing it and learn it. And any chance I get every day, in fact, I would go out to the cafes with my book and I'd spend 2-3 hours at lunch learning French,
Amazing.
Which is basically a secondary commitment there.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Oh, you've done it right.
It was a fabulous thing. French language is a wonderful language. I mean, the culture is amazing and very complicated. The terrain of France is very, very unique and different, and it's beautiful everywhere.
Yeah.
So there's no part of France except where modern commerce has desecrated the natural beauty that isn't stunning.
Right.
So France in its entirety, in its natural form and in its historic form, is a most amazing country, very, very beautiful. And so what you find is that there are incredible differences over a 10-mile stretch. And that often there's a culture that exists on one side of a river and another, or on one side of a hill or another. And I mean, it was much more drastic than that 100 years ago. But still, the reverberations of that live on in the form of clafoutis that you eat for lunch, or the way that your boeuf bourguignon is put together, or the potatoes lyonnaise here, and then you go over the hill there and it's frites, Right. So it's like a wonderful thing. Mostly we know that by way of the diversity, and enormous diversity of French cuisine. And honestly, we're only present to a small part of that.
Right.
It's a never-ending marvel to me, the diversity of that, and the styles of wine, the façon, and the cuisinier, n'importe quoi. And you just find endless sausage. They're endless, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I love that, and I think it's something that we had in America, and you have had it everywhere. So it's one of the great things about an impenetrable world, or a world that's apart, is that people struggle with their unique problems and come to unique solutions. And that's what we call culture in some cases and in some ways, right? And so you lose that, right, when you open up to cross-pollination. So sometimes it's great, and sometimes there's things lost in it. And, most of all, we like going to visit a foreign culture because of the uniqueness, and I'm loving all of that. I so enjoy the distinctive qualities of French culture, and I'm off into it.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to travel around France, but I still have yet to get to Burgundy. I was in Bordeaux last fall and Narbonne, that's Le Clap region, but I'm dying to get to Burgundy. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a wonderful
Maybe
world to discover. And also you have to go from there into the Massif Central, which nobody ever goes to visit. But I'm in argument these days for visiting the parts of the world where nobody else goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
If you're a romantic, if you like the old ways, there are plenty of places in Europe. Anytime you're in an agricultural region now, you're looking back to the old days, because here in the States, a lot of people in times have required people to move to the big cities. And so if you want a sample of, the way that it used to be done, you go back out to the countryside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, nothing beats a local small town French farmer's market where the produce is fresh. You've got the local cheese guy, just the best.
It's killer, man. I'm going to give you some advice about how to buy a place over there after we're done.
Sounds good. Spectacular. So obviously New Orleans is heavily influenced by French culture, Spanish culture, European. Do you still see a lot of similarities in New Orleans to European culture? The history
Absolutely.
of it? Yeah.
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, there's a tremendous influence of French culture on New Orleans. In many different ways. There's evidence of the Cartesian thinking and philosophy in the Catholicism of our city, and also evidence of the mysticism evident in the Catholicism and the aspects of it that are brought here. I would not attribute that entirely to the Catholicism, but it's definitely a part of the mix, the rich allegorical aspects, and then there's the food, of course, which is very, very influenced by the French cooking, and the language, our language, and we even have communities all around the city of New Orleans that still speak a great deal of French. In fact, where I started to learn French was I got a French girlfriend when I came down here, a Cajun girl. She was from Golden Meadow, and her parents spoke French. Her mom spoke some English, and her dad spoke only French. And so after a year or so, it was like if the only way I was going to have a relationship with him was to start to learn to speak French. So I think I'm trying to recollect how that dovetailed with my trips to France, but that's where I started to learn French.
Yeah.
I said I have to begin to, at least learn the politesse with, to communicate. And anyway, the influence of France here is strong and welcome. It's a great culture. Their emphasis on excellence and their excellence in culinary art, is very, very welcome. Now, I feel that we also bring something to France too. And I think that they're influenced by our musical traditions. They're influenced greatly by jazz. They're influenced by our cultural expressiveness here. Now, don't forget that France, was in Haiti and before, and France has the islands, the French islands.
Right.
So there's an influence. France is intimately tied to Africa in very similar ways that New Orleans is tied to Africa and Haiti too. So there's this very interesting overlapping there and cultural coincidence where we dance with an African tradition, as do the French people too. And they've embraced that just as we have in New Orleans. So we have a polyphonic culture here that has benefited from that influence in many ways also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite New Orleans dish?
What would that be? Yeah, I'm going to give it to beans and rice.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yep.
Well, I know you have to get going, James, so I won't keep you anymore, but I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing all the insights you did.
It's been my pleasure, and I appreciate your commitment to the arts, and I'm very thankful for my opportunity to make, I hope, a small contribution to any understanding in that way.
Absolutely.
Thanks again.
I really appreciate it. Thank
Okay.
you.